joining us for this call of state food policy councils. We know that some of you that may be in the Northeast are experiencing some snow. I hope you're enjoying it on the second day of spring. We're going to start off today a little different format for the call, and we have a couple of presentations about state legislation reports, and then we'll go around and we'll have time to do breakout sessions after the presentations. And I recognize that there are a number of people that are on the phone and listening as well. So we will share out PowerPoint presentations. We're recording the webinar, this presentation, the first part of it also, so that we can share it with you if you can't see the slides. But to get started, I just wanted to run through a couple of housekeeping issues with Zoom, the platform that we're using, and to talk a little bit about what's to come with the call after the presentations. So I'm Karen Bassarow with the Center for a Livable Future, and we are kind of convening this call this afternoon, but have presentations by Peter Reddick, who's coordinator from the California Food Policy Council, as well as Pamela Cook and Claire Uno with the Tisch Center for Food Education and Policy out of New York. Both of them are going to talk about reports that they have produced on state and local legislation and how those reports came together and what they're doing with them, kind of as models or examples that could be replicated in other locations and states. And then we'll talk a little bit briefly about a report that the Center for a Livable Future did on Maryland legislation. It's not nearly as in-depth as these other ones. After the presentations, we'd like to be able to set aside time for discussion amongst state councils on topics of interest to you. So if there are burning questions you have about your state council for other councils that you want to hear their experience about, or if there's something that's happening in general around policy or in the food system that you want to have a discussion with other like-minded members or peers amongst food policy councils, we're setting aside time for those discussions, and using Zoom, we're going to break people into small groups so that you can have a more intimate conversation. So we have a couple of ideas of topics. One would be a continuation of the state legislation reports. Another one could possibly be kind of this discussion that's happening on the Food Policy Network's listserv around individual versus organizational membership in councils. But we really want to hear from you. What are topics that you want to talk to other councils about? So during the time that we're listening to the presentations, please use your chat box to chat in ideas or suggestions. And then after the presentations, before the breakout sessions, we'll vote on what people want to talk about, and then we'll break you up into groups. This is our first time using Zoom breakout rooms. So when we get to that point, please have patience with us as we kind of navigate getting people into small groups. So first, in order to use Zoom, everyone is on mute. I put you on mute as you came into the room just so that we minimize the amount of background noise, but you all have controls to be able to unmute yourselves as well as to turn on and off your video. At the bottom of your screen, if you scroll down with your cursor, there's a toolbar. On that toolbar to the far left is a mute button and a stop video button. Those are the controls that you can use to be able to mute and unmute yourselves and to turn on and off your video. Along that bottom bar too, as well, there is a chat button that you can click, and that opens up a box where you can chat and be able to communicate with other members privately or with the entire group. Please share your ideas for small breakout groups as well through this chat box. And so those are the three main controls that we will use. We are reserving time at the end of the presentations for questions, so we ask that you remain muted throughout the presentations, and then when we get to the end, we will open it up for you to unmute yourselves and ask questions of the presenters. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. We'll get started with our presentations, and I want to turn it over to Claire and Pamela. If you guys want to kick it off and talk about your Empowered Eater reports that you just released through the Tisch Center, we'd love to hear about them.
Can you hear us? Oh, we might. Karen, can you hear us? Okay, great. Sorry, we're going to get the presentation open and then we'll get started. All right, sorry for the delay. We had the wrong one open by accident.
Okay. Where is it? Mom, I can help. Okay. Can you all see that?
Right now, what we can see is your file folder.
Okay, really? Ugh.
So if you go down to the bottom, back to share screen.
Yep.
And then in the list of documents, you should have one for PowerPoint.
Yeah, it's not showing the correct one though. Showing a different one that we certainly could use.
Yeah, that's it.
There we go. Okay, can you see that now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, here we go.
So we're going to be talking about our Empowered Eaters Report, which is a roadmap for stronger nutrition education policies and programs. And we were really looking at policy at all levels using New York State and New York City as examples. So as Karen said before, we're from the Laurie M. Tisch Center for Food Education and Policy, and we cultivate research on the connection between a just, sustainable food system and healthy eating, and then translate that into recommendations and resources for educators, policymakers, and community advocates. And we see schools as a critical lever for learning and social change. So now Claire's going to talk about what we did at for the report.
So, as Pam said, we did use New York State and New York City as case studies, but in order to really understand the landscape of food and nutrition education policy, we had to start at the federal level to really understand what the landscape there looked like, and then see how things trickle down to the state and city level, and what might be unique to the state and city level of policy. And just to say quickly, when we say nutrition education, we're really talking very broadly about policies and initiatives and funding streams that give people the skills and knowledge and motivation to eat well as create healthy environments and environments that make that kind of eating possible. So a really broad definition. So this is the methods, and we have this broken out more. If anyone's interested and wants to try to recreate this for their state or city, we can certainly share it with you. But to say briefly, the way that we did this is we aggregated all the federal and state laws and local laws and regulations around anything that had to do with this broad definition of nutrition education. We looked through federal, state, and city budget documents, and because not everything is available online or in a printed document, we had to fill in the gaps and also get a deeper understanding of the landscape by conducting and analyzing 102 interviews with 142 people from 60 entities, and that included state and local agencies, government agencies, as well as DBOs. So we found a very complex policy and funding landscape that starts at the federal level, and then those policies and initiatives, 70 in fact, that we identified, flow down to the state, city, and to local providers, and then of course end up impacting the individuals and families in the places where we live. Just to say quickly, we broke these into 3 buckets of different types of initiatives, ones that focus on nutrition education and require it. So that would be like SNAP education, for those of you who are familiar with it. There's another category that have a different main focus than nutrition education, such as increasing access to food, but still require nutrition education. So that would be like the Head Start program, where you know, food and education are given in a setting, but nutrition education is part of that program. And then initiatives that have a different main focus, such as increasing access to food, but may include nutrition education. They just don't require it. And that can be a research project from the NIH. It can be like the FINI program. So that's a pretty broad catchment area. Just to say, at the federal level, there are many bills and vehicles that can authorize or fund nutrition education initiatives, and then the corresponding federal agencies that administer them. And so this is sort of what it looks like when you drill down to New York City. And one of the things that we found is that there really is very little unifying strategy, that a lot of these initiatives are really great and important and needed, and they are happening in silos. And so as they come out of the different federal agencies that they originate in, and then go down to state and local agencies, there may or may not be any sort of alignment or coordination, and there are some real like system and structural issues for that. But the thing to remember is that ultimately they do all, we have this sort of big bar that says participants at the bottom, so they are ultimately pooling and reaching families and communities. So it's important to see some alignment. So some key findings from both the document research that we did as well as the interviews is that New York State, really a great leader in food and nutrition policy, doing a lot of innovative things. We were the first state to have WIC fruit and vegetable checks. We have a very forward-looking prevention agenda for preventive health. We have, you can see our governor there with the New York State Grown and Certified program. New York City also does quite a few really amazing and progressive things around food policy. We publish the food metrics report every year. Our agencies are really trying to purchase more local foods. We have just a growing number of farmers markets and programs around that. And when it comes to food and nutrition education policy, more still needs to be done. So some of our very top level findings are that when it comes to the policies and the policy process, more community input is needed all along the way, from developing policies, what kind of policies we're developing, how they're implemented, how they're monitored, that a more robust community input process is needed all throughout that system. That the vast majority of initiatives, at least in New York State and City, are originating at the federal level and then being administered by state and city agencies and then being implemented by local providers. And it makes these programs very vulnerable to federal and state cuts, which we're seeing. If any of you had a chance to see the budget that the White House put out, or obviously have been following what's going on with the Farm Bill and cuts that have been proposed to SNAP and SNAP Education and just a whole variety of programs. And here in our state, we see both sides of the coin. We see that our governor just introduced for the budget process this year a really great farm to school proposal that increases support for farm to school, and at the same time is proposing really significant cuts to preventive health programs that work in concert with farm to school and that fund things like the Creating Healthy Schools and Community program here in New York State that does all sorts of really great work around healthy retail and school food, school wellness policies. So it's a mixed bag, but bottom line, our funding is very vulnerable for these types of initiatives. And again, just to say, one of the themes we heard from our interviewees was just how challenging this lack of unifying strategy is, and how when initiatives and policies and funding streams are siloed and have different reporting requirements and different metrics and potentially different objectives, even though they're all sort of trying to reach the same goal of people having accessible, affordable, and healthy food, it's very hard to pool these funding streams and sort of align work across agencies, even within agencies, and certainly when you get to the local level. I'm going to hand it over to Pam because this study actually had a third level. In addition to this state and city, we did a deeper dive into New York City schools. Our other study looked across the lifespan from birth to elderly populations. And then we did this one really deep dive into schools and school policies and programs.
And this actually also included not only, the other one was only government funded programs, and then this included all different nutrition education programs that were in schools. And this report is a separate report called A is for Apple, the State of Nutrition Education Programs in New York City Schools. So what we were looking at is the landscape of the nutrition education programs during the last school year. And we ended up getting data from 40 organizations that run 101 programs in the 1,840 schools in New York City, and also created a searchable database that could be used by schools as well as the programs to basically find programs for schools as well as for the programs themselves to find partnerships with other groups. What we found is that almost 56% of the schools had at least one of these programs. However, 815 schools did not have any. That doesn't mean that they weren't doing any nutrition education on their own. It's just that they didn't have any of these outside programs that could be part of SNAP education or other government funding or other programs coming into the schools. We also had data from 5 years prior, from the 2011-12 school year, that didn't include all grades or all programs, but actually was with 3 boroughs, Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens in New York City, and only with elementary schools. And we actually found an increase from 39% of the schools having programming. And for this group of schools, 71% of schools now having programming, as well as many more schools, as you can see by the darker green bands, having 2 or 3 or more programs. We also found that the elementary schools had much more programming, and then that went down as you went to middle schools and high schools. Okay, now we're going to turn it back to Claire for the New York City and New York State recommendations.
So I'm going to go through some of the recommendations that came out of the 2 Empowered Eaters reports, and then hand it back over to Pam, and we'll drill down into the recommendations about how to improve the program landscape for the programs in schools. The first recommendation was the need to expand the scope, reach, and sustainability of nutrition education. So, I mean, I think it's a really good example, as we could see that only 55% of schools have any sort of program, and that is certainly the case in different public settings across the city and state. So whether it's senior centers or early child care centers or Head Start programs, there is a real need for more of this type of opportunities. And in terms of sustainability, one of the key things that was highlighted was longer funding terms, that our policymakers should be looking at how can we make funding more stable and for longer amounts of time, because as we all know, these are really complex challenges that have real systems-based reasons for why people lack access or education around healthy food. And so we need to be able to help our community-based organizations have longer, more stable funding. Enhancing our providers' capacity to actually implement nutrition educations, and that can range from everything from more materials translated into the hundreds of languages that are spoken in our city and state, all the way to this greater amount of feedback that implementers and community members need to have in the policymaking process. In terms of strengthening policies for nutrition education, something that you all may see that we certainly see here is that there can be a lot of excitement in certain administrations or for certain policymakers around a healthy food access or education program. And so maybe it'll come into being through executive order or just through some sort of funding line, but it's not really embedded into like regulations or into statute. And so then the political situation changes and those initiatives go away. So to the extent that we can really look for opportunities to embed these important programs into statute, into regulation, we think that would really strengthen the longevity of them. And then this was just a theme that came up again, and it goes back to that crazy slide with all the different programs and initiatives, but putting together mechanisms that really help facilitate collaboration and coordination among these initiatives. So within agencies, across agencies, and then up and down as the policies are administered and implemented and then engaged in by community members, so that they're really pooling to create comprehensive supports for folks to eat well. And so Pam can talk about what we think is needed for nutrition education programs.
And I realize that we're over our 15 minutes, so I'm going to do this really quickly, is that one, we think that we need really more coordination, so a network that would actually help all of these programs to work together, because it's really all of the individual programs reaching out and trying to get into schools. There also needs to be more investment, but through capacity, funding, technical assistance, tools and training, and then more collaboration from all players, from schools and from the programs that would make this work together. So we can take questions later on what we think our next steps in advocacy are. Thank you.
And we have this slide, which has our, where you can get these reports. The A's for Apple one will be up by very early next week at the very latest.
Thanks, Pamela and Claire. That was great. We're going to wait for questions until the end, if that's okay with you guys to hang on, and let Peter go and talk about the state legislation report out of California. All right, Peter, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for Karen for running my slides. I am a living example of rural broadband limitations. I can do voice, audio, or slides, but not any two at one time reliably. So I thought I'd first introduce what we are and what we've been doing. The California Food Policy Council, some of you have heard me speak about it on previous phone calls, is a grassroots organization. We started meeting about 7 years ago, officially founded 6 years ago, and we have 27 member councils out of approximately 40 food policy council and council equivalents in California. Membership is an issue that will come up again a little bit later. You can go to the second slide. When we were founded, we had funding and we had a backbone organization, Roots of Change, directing us. We have since become independent of Roots of Change. We are a fiscally sponsored project of the Center for Popular Research, Education, and Policy. Money has become a little bit of an issue as our initial seed funding has run out. And again, that will come up in the conversation. Early on, we created what we call the legislative report or the legislation tracker, as our signature product. The cover that you see on the screen is the cover of our 5th annual report. And it's matured over the years. It is fairly well received. We're having discussions about what to do with it. We have since taken on partners. This is no longer simply our own report. While Roots of Change is no longer the backbone of CAFPC, they are a partner for the legislative report. And the California Food and Farming Network, a loose, rather unofficial organization of approximately 40 statewide nonprofits and other NGOs, has become a partner. And my colleague Paul Towers from CFFN is on the call, so he can join us for Q&A later. Next, Karen, please. Okay, so I realize this is a lot of dense text, and we're not going to stay on this slide very long. This is the heart of the report. The report is 16 pages, and links have been sent out. We can send a link to the current report again as a follow-up to this call. But the heart of the report is actually a tally sheet of what all of the legislators have done with all of the votes that we have identified as priority votes on food and farming in California during the year. The first time I visited a legislative aide with this report in hand, she had not heard of it before. She took the 16-page program out of my hands, opened it to this page, and I swear her eyebrows hit the ceiling. You're tracking this. Yes, we are. And the tracking itself is a great advantage, letting the legislators know that there is a constituency out there that is setting priorities, that does care about what's going on in the state legislature regarding food and farming. So, next one, Karen, please. So people generally ask me, I'm going to talk nuts and bolts for the rest of the time. People generally ask me how we produce this. And as you heard me describe, California Food Policy Council and our partners at the California Food and Farming Network are a grassroots organization or pair of grassroots organizations. We significantly crowdsource this legislative report. It's a year-long project. We follow the legislature's own calendar significantly. You can see at the top of the screen in the green text, rough outline of our legislature's calendar. All of the bills for 2018 have been submitted, and we are starting to talk about them. They will go through the meat grinder of the legislative process until about Labor Day. I don't know the exact end date, and it varies depending on whether it's an election year or not, which this is, so it will be a little on the earlier side, at which point the governor has a month to deal with the bills. We wanted to wrap up a little bit early, but we have found that some bills will morph dramatically at the very end of the season, and that's put an extra step in our process to make sure that something that we liked has not become something we didn't like. So we've already started the process this year, this being our 6th one. Since we are somewhat shorter of money than in the past, we started by asking, should we do this? And the answer came out, yes, we should, even if we have to scale back a little bit on what we do. That our members expect this. We have a certain amount of the public that expects it, and the legislators are paying attention. We wanted to do and have begun a plus delta exercise. We had a little bit of issue with the process. We want to get our calendar. As you see in front of you, it's a rough calendar, but we want to get that polished up a little bit early. We want to talk about the format changes. As I mentioned to folks on a phone call yesterday, we've had a little bit of issue with people talking about the prioritized bills where we decide what's important, and that doesn't necessarily mean that even a majority of us like the bill. We are tracking important bills that we have a split opinion on, or occasionally we don't like. And we need to improve our language about that. We have about 80 people who pay attention to this on a couple of listservs, and we invite them to a series of phone calls. The 2 biggest phone calls, perhaps 3 depending on the number of bills, are in front of us in the time period March to May. They tend to get about 35, 40 people on the call, and they are actually to review and prioritize the bills. This is an exercise in seeing what our members are paying attention to and having them convince us that this is something that we as a group should pay attention to. We should give it a fairly higher priority. Not surprisingly, more of the information comes from the NGOs who have a much deeper knowledge about the bills than a lot of the FPC folks. The partnership between these 2 groups is something we're still figuring out how to deal with, but something that's very important. The NGOs have a tendency to have a very deep knowledge and a very narrow field of vision, where FPC members tend to have a very broad field of vision, but rather shallow knowledge on many of the issues. Figuring out how to deal with this is complicated, but we've seen some powerful synergies come out of it. The other groups tend to be considerably smaller, the groups that review the process and the format, the groups that discuss the trends and themes that are emerging from this legislative session, the groups that actually start writing some of the text. All of the text except 1 page is crowdsourced. We decide who will write on what topic. We have given a page to our partner at Roots of Change as an introductory letter, and that is written by our partner. But everything else is crowdsourced. Who has the expertise? Who will write it? We do an editing and approval session. So there is a chance to revisit everything, and we have had issues of tone and stridency that we've asked to be calmed down a little bit. The nature of a very large tent is that some of our members are not comfortable with anything that's too strident. Each of those subcommittees, I would say, gets 5 to 10 people on a phone call, deciding on what the themes and issues are and starting to write the sections. We wrap this up approximately with the end of the governor's review period, get that last bit of data in there, what he did as far as signing or vetoing things, and put this through the final review process. We've gone back and forth with the date. We released it just before Thanksgiving 2 years ago. We found the process from the end of the session to the release date a bit cramped, and it didn't seem to get us very much to go out just before the legislators all disappeared for holiday break. This year we released it in mid-January. The timing of that seemed to be a lot better. We haven't set on our calendar what we're going to do in the future. Both of the timings have their own champions. Next slide, please, Karen. So I keep mentioning that this is a tool for the legislators, and the heart of it is that tally sheet to let them know that there's a constituency watching. But as challenging as it is to write for multiple audiences, we do feel that we have multiple audiences, that this is an educational tool for various aspects of the public, from our members to the press to the general public as well. And that comes out a little bit more in the writing, in the text that goes around the tables. I think, and I'll let Paul jump in a while with this, but I think that we would want to say that the legislators, we've gone back and forth about this, are our main audience. We do print copies of the legislative report, and we have somebody take them around to each and every office, hand them, hopefully, preferably, to the aide in charge of agricultural and food issues. Getting the rest of the public involved usually devolves to our 27 member chapters and the 40 NGO members of the California Food and Farm Network. It's something we want to give a little bit more guidance to help people get involved. I know that one of our Central Coast chapters in Monterey sent a press release to their local paper and got an article in about our 5th annual report. They actually were helped by the fact that we, and in this case, Roots of Change, wrote a sample press release that they only had to modify. It was probably helped in Monterey by the fact that they hadn't reported on it before. This isn't necessarily something that we'll get repeat reporting on in any given area 2 years in a row. For most papers, there's a novelty effect. Member councils themselves have very different attitudes toward this. Some are cheerleaders and champions. Others are members of California FPC for other reasons, for collaborative reasons rather than advocacy reasons, and they look at this as an advocacy tool. It is not only something that they don't want to spend time on, it can be something that a number of them are quite nervous about, especially the local councils that have a lot of government members on the councils. And these are challenges that we keep working through. Why are we doing this, and what are we getting out of it? And that will be a big push for our process conversations in the new year. Next one, please, Karen. So something people ask, and especially you'll notice even in the PDF, it's very nicely formatted and there are quite a few graphics, and we do print copies, is what does this cost? We are grassroots, and we have those approximately 80 people doing a lot of the work of research prioritization and writing. But as you all probably know, volunteers to be productive need to be coordinated. So we have an organizer and administration, somebody who keeps the database, who organizes the calls, and keeps us on track, more or less. That last year was Paul Towers, and the budget last year for that was, I believe, just under $5,000. We have contracted with an external graphic design and publications publishing house to create this document. We've created over time a lot of graphics. The cost is coming down a little bit because the graphics are stabilizing. It has cost as much as $20,000 a year to get this out. We think the cost can come down to $10,000 as we are in a little bit of a money crunch. We're going to probably have to work hard to get the cost down to about $10,000 and reuse graphics. We talked about going PDF only. We have printed about 2,000 copies at a cost of about $3,000. I don't think we want to send PDF to the legislators, to the 120 legislators, because having something that they can pass around the office and focus on seems to be quite important. We may want to print fewer copies, although we're finding that our member councils do like to have paper in their hands for when they walk into offices and have, again, something to focus on. And something we started a couple of years ago, last year in fact, is to have a release party. We created a new page in our 4th issue, which is Legislative Champion, those legislators who have, during the course of our history, repeatedly worked on bills that the majority of our folks have cared about, that we have genuinely liked, and given them an award. In the 4th annual report, 1 showed up and 3 sent aides at least. We had a very good meeting. We talked about it. Their absence was felt. This January, not only did the 2 legislators we honor both show up, immediately RSVPing, but a few more came just to hear and support that 5 going on 6 years in, the legislators care about this. They're noticing that we're noticing. It was a fun and useful evening, good networking among the members, activists, and among the legislators and their aides. It is something we're planning to do again in the future, and it cost about $7,000. So the total cost to a grassroots organization of producing this is in the neighborhood of $25,000. And we have spent more. That's a little bit on a shoestring, but it's more or less what we're going to look at this year. So last slide. You can find us on the website. You'll notice that our presence is somewhat minimal at the moment. You're welcome to contact me, and I will be happy to take questions in the breakout group.
Thanks, Peter. That was great. We have one more presentation about a different style of report, and then we'll open it up for everyone to ask questions. And this report comes from the Center for a Livable Future. It was produced by our Maryland Food Systems Mapping team. If you give me a second, I'll pull up the presentation. And part of what we're doing is kind of showing tools that could be models for your states of reports that could be created in terms of understanding what the policy landscape looks like in your state. In Maryland, we have a legislative session that runs for 4 months out of the year. It's quick, it's fast, it goes pretty quickly, and it's every year. In 2015, the Center for a Livable Future and our food systems mapping team put together a report to showcase, kind of to show off what's happening around food systems legislation in Maryland. And it was more of a scan of what the bills look like. The report's called the Food System Policy in Maryland, Food and Agricultural Legislation in the General Assembly of Maryland in 2015. And I'm going to run through mostly the methodology and what the report entails. This was not created by a food policy council, and it was not intended to make recommendations either. The real purpose of the report was to understand what legislation is coming out of the state related to food systems, and what's getting passed, what's getting proposed, and who are our legislators that are supportive or sponsoring bills. So the Maryland Food System Map Project is a project of the Center for a Livable Future. They catalog data across the food system in Maryland and have a map that showcases different variables. And one of the things they wanted to look at was policy. In Maryland, you can download a spreadsheet of legislation from the General Assembly site, which makes it very easy to see what bills are being proposed and to search it. And so it's a great resource. It's also a great way to get information about legislation and makes it easily accessible. So what we did was took an Excel spreadsheet of all the legislation that was proposed in Maryland for the 2015 General Assembly and then searched it based on keywords across the food system using 70 terms. These are a sampling of those terms. And based on what came out of the search, we categorized the legislation into 10 food systems categories, although 2 did not have any bills that were in those categories, one being farm to institution and the other one being food assistance programs. And a lot of this took digging into the legislation beyond just the title to understand what the bill proposed, because some of them would pull up information not related to the food system. Waste pulls up a spectrum of issues that don't just include food. So there was an analysis of, or an exploration of what the bill included, just to make sure that it was touching an element of the food system. From there, the report was pulled together, and I want to say it's a 16-page report. It's not very long. It provides a summary of the bill number. If there were 2 bills, one out of the House and one out of the Senate, that were complementary, it provides both bill numbers, who the sponsors were, and how far they made it in committee, if they passed or not. So their status, whether they were withdrawn, whether they passed, or whether they were stuck in committee. During the 2015 legislative session, there were over 2,200 bills that were introduced. Those are not just across the food system, but in general. 75 of those related to the food system and 19 were passed. So the report provides a nice kind of overview in terms of who are supportive legislators who are introducing bills, what are those bills include, and it kind of provides a baseline. There were no recommendations that came out of this. It was not vetted through a process. It was not intended to rate legislators. It was really just intended to provide a baseline of information. We have not since repeated the report, but it just gives kind of an idea of something simple that can be created, or information that could be pulled and synthesized to show what the baseline is in terms of legislation on food system that's coming out at state level after the General Assembly. So we attached this report to the email that was sent out to state councils. It is not online currently, but we will be posting it into the Food Policy Network's database, and we'll send a link to that so you can access it online as well. So I just wanted to briefly go over that report and then now turn it back to everyone else. We've just heard 3 presentations about kind of state legislation reports, and wanted to open it up for questions of the presenters, and also open it up to share if you have experiences or stories or reports that are coming out of your states, to talk about what those processes were like, what questions you have for the presenters. I'm going to unmute everyone. If you will please take note that you are on mute and mute yourselves so we minimize disruption. Also, I request that when you ask a question of the presenters, if you will please introduce yourselves, tell us what state you're from, and if you're with the Food Policy Council, what council you are with. And everyone is unmuted now.
Megan Lovelace, Colorado Food Systems Advisory Council. This question is for the gentleman from California. When you do the release party for your document, have you considered perhaps, I don't know if you guys do a drive-in or a day where you all kind of convene at the Capitol to maybe present it then, just maybe from a funding standpoint to save you all a little money, get FaceTime with your legislators, and have a coffee with them or something like that.
We did coordinate our semi-annual meeting this year with the release party. It was a little earlier in the year than we generally wanted to meet for that because we do like to talk about legislation and very little of it is submitted by then. We always encourage our people to walk around and visit their legislator's office, including I know a few people who have that coffee that you're talking about, and it is a powerful tool. So this year, they did it with legislative reports in hand. We have given training to some of the new members who aren't used to doing legislative visits, and that seems to help. Regardless of whether we have one or two gatherings next year, I think we want to encourage that legislative visit. So it is a good chance that we will have a release again in January, and it will be a smaller group of people that would have to find their own way to Sacramento, and that we will meet around the beginning of March when all of the bills are in and gives us something to talk about and build in time for those legislative visits. That's yet to be determined. But thanks for the thoughts.
Thanks, Peter. Just wanted to let you know that you're breaking up a little bit. Your audio is kind of going in and out, so I'm not sure that everyone caught what you just said.
I think this is Paul.
Challenge of rural living.
I was just going to reinforce what Peter said, and I think from our perspective, so this is Paul Towers. I coordinate the California Food Informing Network, like Peter said, which is the 40 plus organizations that are statewide in nature that engage around food and farming issues as well. And then that is sort of Sacramento centric. I'm also a member of the Sacramento Food Policy Council Steering Committee. And, one of the things we've continued to also think about is how do we help support members, again, in their district so that their, individual food policy councils are building relationship and I think, visibility around issues throughout the legislative process in the district, because that helps show that there's sort of political interest and muscle around some of the key issues. And I think that, sort of an area to think about increasingly for the future that's also a lot less expensive than getting people from the far reaches of a really big state like California. I mean, part of, as Peter said, it's a challenge of, getting folks from Southern California up to Northern California is quite expensive. And I think that's true for folks in bigger and, sort of larger states. The nature of bringing people to Sacramento is a very expensive endeavor. So that's why we, I think thinking increasingly about with little resources, how can we demonstrate support also in districts where members, often have 2 or 3 offices in their districts. California legislators represent districts the size of many congressional districts, right? So they're quite large. So just to sort of underscore that, I think there's lots of ways that we, continue to want to think about that.
Thank you. And then for everybody, does everybody disseminate the bill tracker from their state government to all of their membership so that people can, independently look after these bills as they're moving through the legislative session?
Everybody gets a PDF copy. We disseminate that quite broadly. We ask people how many printed copies they want. and within our budget deliver, because we know that there are uses for printed copies. As Paul said, local legislative visits are important, and bringing a copy with you to that can be very useful.
I'm sorry, I meant to clarify, I should have clarified that question. I meant for everybody on the call that every state has a bill tracker through their state government that, so not just specific for California, but in general, that our food policy councils across the United States distributing the bill tracker so that their membership can keep track of these bills as they move through session. Sorry, if it's unclear.
Megan, do you all in Colorado do that with your councils?
Through the Colorado Food Policy Network.
Okay.
And then there's just kind of a guideline as well, because, you know, just looking at the bill tracker without understanding what you're looking for could be cumbersome. But we also have advocates that can help members through that process if they need assistance.
And Megan, who are those advocates? Are they advocates from different organizations, or is that within the Colorado Food Policy Network?
Yes, so the Food Policy Network is, you know, across the state, made up of several different stakeholders, and among those stakeholders, we're using the policy directors from different nonprofits to disseminate that information, clarify, and offer guidance. And so we have several across the state that would be considered the, you know, the advisors in that role.
Yeah, I think from the California standpoint, we're still mostly using the food policy tracker as a retroactive document rather than a real-time one, and it's been a struggle given, and I'm sure you face this, everyone in state legislatures faces this, is that bills, and Peter said this already, is bills change so much over the life of the legislative process, at least here they sure do, that, you know, identifying bills, identifying even positionality regularly about those happens so quickly, and it's been hard. I think it's hard to warehouse all that information well enough that people can be aware of what's happening. And no one's resourced to do that currently, you know, in California. So I think it's something that between the Food and Farming Network and California Food Policy Council, we're interested in doing more of, and we do it via individual groups that voluntarily opt in to share updates about what's happening with their bill and what the updates are, and create space for collaboration. But I don't think that we sort of haven't, I think that's the next phase of our work. And we started trying to do that this past year. We created the top 20 list of what we're paying attention to and circulated that around the Capitol and got legislators and staff to know those were important bills to our broader community. But I think we're not quite at that kind of level of what sounds like amazing detail in Colorado.
We totally just use the colorado.gov's website's bill tracker, and we give everybody that link and just say, hey, check it out. You know, if your favorite bill, you know, follow your favorite bill. And so it's kind of autonomous. I love that you think we have it all figured out. I don't know if we do. But just a thought in general, I assume every state's gov has a bill tracker, you know, and you could just put your bill in and then it will send you notices. So just something that's kind of easy to say to all of your group is, you know, take this and run with it, and not run with it meaning please call your legislator every 5 seconds, but meaning that now you know what's happening, that the individuals know, you know, when does, you know, where is it in committee, or is it in appropriations, or what hearing is it in, and you know, that's all in the bill tracker. So you and I don't have to be doing that work for our membership. That you can just go click on the website.
We do pass those links on to members. Okay.
You got it, Peter.
So we do have a good legislative tracker in the government, leginfo.gov.ca, and we do pass links into that back and forth quite frequently. I have found it challenging to convince that tool to update me regularly on all the bills I'm interested in. Other people have had more success. I need to find out what I might be doing wrong sometimes. But I know other people have been very frustrated by it. And so, yeah, it is a big ask of the grassroots people to keep reminding and keep pointing. And yet I think there is some advantage to that, to keeping people engaged, that you're not just getting an automatic response or fighting a cumbersome tool.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think these might be state by state tool differences. I would say, because I do some work in Hawaii as well, and by contrast, Hawaii has a much better legislative tracking system and participation system that's built for individual engagement as well. And I think California, by contrast, is not at all built for that. It is built for organizational and interest group engagement, and everything is pretty much updated retroactively. So it's very hard to know about an upcoming hearing or opportunity. And so you have to have that knowledge, which is why I think what Peter's speaking to. So it sounds like it's probably some state by state specifics.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? I have a question go ahead, Michael.
What is the intention of the reports to leave it to your component members to take positions on where, if the bill is good or bad, and it's just that you're paying attention to certain bills? Is that an intention? And also, do you do anything to sort of get individuals to make calls on particular issues, but that's sort of having to take place in a different part of your organization or a different sort of tax status or organization to take the reins on moving things forward at the legislature?
We haven't done enough in California to worry about tax implications, and we have talked about that. So I think we're in good space there. It is significantly capacity and desire of members. As I've said, we do have members of members who don't like to advocate. They're in this for the collaborative purposes. We have taken the occasional position. There are some bills where we've had virtually no opposition from within our fairly significant membership. 600 entities are represented among the 27 member councils with probable duplication. But if there is any meaningful caution dissonance, then I don't think we want to go there, especially given our capacity issues. So we will advocate minimally, but we will usually recommend to our members that if this interests you and you can advocate, here is an opportunity. The listserv is our friend. We have a couple, they aren't all that busy, but they're busy enough with these opportunities, and they have proven to get the people out, and we have had some impact collectively on a couple of bills because of it. We do, the limited thing that we do is within the tracker, that page that I didn't keep up very long, but you might have noticed it was color-coded. We do try to say whether the majority of our folks are in favor or opposed to a bill, or we are using yellow when we have a mixed opinion but still think it's important.
I'm going to ask Claire and Pamela about you're not necessarily tracking specific bills or legislation, but you do have recommendations that you're putting out in your reports. And was there a vetting process with your partners, and are you now working with them to push some of those recommendations forward?
So in terms of the vetting process, because we primarily got information from folks within government agencies, as well as then, some of the nonprofits that implement these initiatives. We held listening sessions like after coming up with the key findings and recommendations, but before putting anything out publicly, to get their feedback, to make sure that what we had heard and sort of aggregated through qualitative analysis, that when we said it back to them, that it made sense. And then a few of the agencies had asked to see a copy of the report prior to it being published, and so we complied with that as well, although we reserved the right to decide whether or not we wanted to make the changes that they had suggested. So that was really the vetting process, and so we did get, I think, some good sort of iterative feedback along the way. And this didn't have, I mean, we were really trying to get the landscape before taking action on anything. And as everyone keeps bringing up, that obviously takes funding to be able to mount campaigns. So we're at a point now where we're talking with all of the folks who we collaborate with in the various parts of nutrition education to see like which of these policies, which of these recommendations would really stick, and where is there political opportunities to take advantage of. So we're part of a statewide policy group right now that's pushing for this farm to school legislation that I mentioned, or sorry, not legislation, like a budget ask basically, which fits squarely within some of the recommendations that we had made. So we'll see what happens next with it.
And it was really more to get the wide landscape to then figure out the policy. So I think that's what next step.
Yeah, and one of the things we would like to be able to do is convene, and we did when we launched the New York City school programs report, we brought all of the folks running those programs together. And I mean, that's one thought, is could we continue convening them to see, all right, where are their advocacy opportunities, where are there programmatic opportunities to increase the dissemination of these programs as well as the quality.
Thank you.
To be determined.
Thank you. I know that New York has the State Food Policy Council that's primarily made up of state agencies. Are you all interacting with them? And can you talk a little bit about some of their limitations in terms of being state agencies and advocating for your recommendations?
It's a great question. So we, all along the way, we worked with the woman out of the Department of Ag and Markets who coordinates that council. And in fact, when we did the listening session, the second listening session with all the state folks, many of whom are from agencies, as I mentioned, we piggybacked on the State Food Policy Council meeting. So they had their Food Policy Council meeting, we came in, and I would say about half the council members stayed for our meeting as well. So we did try to take as many opportunities as possible to get our recommendations in front of them. I think one of the shortcomings of that is what we found is that, you know, the silos that exist, even within agencies and certainly across agencies to deal with food policy, they are, like, a lot of feedback we got from agency folks was that it's driven by what's happening at the federal level that is driving the programs that they work on. And so I think it's a really good start, and I think that there's a lot more that could be done. And to the extent that, you know, the research that we did can drive some, like, push that forward a little bit. But it's lacking a lot of voices. I mean, there are some really great voices on that council, and there is large swaths of the folks working in food who are not represented on it.
And it almost ends up being more, at least my take on it is it's almost more of like a defensive stance on what is happening, opposed to a really deep dive look at what could be done to actually make it better and improve things, and advocating for pushing for change. It more ends up being, I don't know, a little bit defending the status quo and why it is that way. So, yeah, which is, I think, some of the reasons why to have it not be all state agencies.
And we happen to be in a state where the governor is really driving the agenda, and agencies are really falling in line with that agenda. And so because he has a very powerful agenda, that can really work in favor of food policy. But, you know, if it's not what he's interested in, then the council is probably not going to get a lot of traction in proposing anything because they work for him.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Thank you.
This is Megan, Colorado Food Systems Advisory Council. I think some of those pieces you brought up about the state and federal, you know, all of these different people participating in these grant funded programs or in these programs have very specific deliverables, right? So maybe it's not that they're not being forthcoming for sure. It's that like they do not want to implicate themselves in any way that they have strayed away from deliverables or they haven't met deliverables in the very, very specific way in which they're meant to meet them. So I think that some of those bottlenecks are, you know, that's an unintentional consequence of some of these larger programs. Nobody wants to lose any funding. That maybe is never going to change. So how do we work within that, you know, and create success, knowing that those barriers or those challenges is a better word, are just going to be in place. And then when you look at the, you know, the NGO side to the nonprofit side, we're all competing for the same pools of money. There's only so much money, and all of us, it's like the Hunger Games. I think that was even listed in there, right? You know, we're all scratching each other's eyes out, trying to, you know, modify our missions to meet the funders. And we've had these discussions robustly for years at the, you know, at all the conferences and at all these things and philanthropist engagement and blah, blah, blah. We may never see that change either, or we may never see it change in a way that is going to be feasible and usable for the boots on the ground, people like ourselves. So, you know, looking at how we work within those systems for success, I think, moving forward, and just knowing that this is our reality and we've got to work with what we have. But thanks for bringing it up. It's so very true.
Well, and I think that I agree. And having had more grants in my grant time that are more research oriented, one of the things that actually has worked well for us is when we have changed course in our research and therefore we're changing what we said were our objectives, we are given the opportunity to say we are making this change and to justify that. And you know, maybe it's more to say on more program oriented grants, that also can happen because things happen. And so, you know, it's a trust of whoever's getting the money is doing good things with it and doing what's supposed to do with it. And it's just that by nature of how the world changes, things can change. And so to allow for that and allow for, you know, justifying why those changes are taking place, I think more advocacy for that would actually help help a lot, I think.
And I totally agree with Pam. And then from the top down perspective, I mean, it's interesting because you'd hear from the city and local folks, well, you know, the state agencies aren't coordinating. And then you hear from the state folks, well, it's because of what's happening at the federal level. And I think someday, and I would not advocate for trying to do any of this in the current administration or political climate, but I do think that someday will be a good time for some advocacy around aligning things and having some real strategy at the federal level. There are examples of it, of these sort of like multi-agency strategies, and that can affect the policies and the funding streams. And, you know, to some extent, yeah, it would be a great time to do that because we're looking at streamlining the federal government. But we do worry that, and we've actually very consciously chosen not to share this with a lot of our federal folks who, you know, may read into it some other message about like waste, fraud, and abuse. But I do think there will come a point when it is the right time to have that conversation and then to be able to have the data to show like, hey, this is what happens in communities when you have this deliverable and you're asking your state to do this deliverable, and you know that like HHS and USDA are keeping the same communities from doing work that is aligned. So we're going to hold on to it and hope that at some point there is a more favorable environment in which to share that message and propose strategies.
And figure out ways that we could say we want collaboration and coordination and streamlining and more funding.
Right. Right.
Because that's what's needed to actually make the changes that we need to make given the current food supply that our country has, you know.
Thank you. Other questions, folks? So I'm going to jump in here just for a minute to say that it's 3:45, and clearly we did not break out into breakout groups because we had great presentations that went on longer, and I think the value of having Q&A is important. Also, we have a smaller group, and so just kind of given the nature of how this is flowing, I think we're going to nix breakout small group discussions, at least for this call, and we will try it on another one, but wanted to make sure that, you know, those of you that are working in other states that may not necessarily have a report, but may have something to share about how you're networking your councils or talking through state legislation or sharing information, that you also still have the opportunity to share your experiences as well, and to see if there are other questions. So just wanted to do a little housekeeping, and then we can continue with the conversation. And with that, I'm going to put Michael Dahl on the spot here for a minute, just to say you are coordinating a network of organizations across the state towards a charter that you all have come up with as a vision, and kind of what are the steps that you're taking in terms of your process of sharing information and engaging those organizations in state legislation?
We're housed at the University of Minnesota, so we can't do things that can be construed as direct lobbying, but that we can do educational advocacy. There are many different groups that are doing direct lobbying at the Capitol that we are allied with, and that get out action alerts on issues that we care deeply about. But we haven't formed, and it's sort of because we still see ourselves as young, as a young statewide network that also spans everything from farm to compost, that coming up with like the top 20 things that we're watching just seems pretty impossible right now. Not that that's something we couldn't look at in the future. What we are trying to do is get a sense from localities what it is they're working on that is in our charter, and what impact that is happening. And some of the things that they're doing locally get state funding. And so we'd be very concerned if a certain pot of money on the state level was being threatened, either because federal cutbacks were trickling down, or because money on a state level was sort of falling through. I don't know if that really answered your question, but it's a limitation that we have right now, and I'm actually slightly encouraged and troubled both at the same time, that just sort of getting the bill tracker out to people, out to organizations, being a method of involving folks on the local level and educating them on how to use that would be a very positive development. But not being, seems like not taking a position on an issue when your organization can is a missed opportunity. And I'm not referring to my organization, I'm referring to many of the local organizations not having the time or energy or expertise to really follow through on something without someone that's able to pay a lot more attention to the issues, sparking their interest, I guess.
Thanks, Michael. Does anyone have any other questions or any stories that you want to share? All right, folks. Going once, twice. Okay, go ahead.
I feel like I might be restating the question again, but what value, I guess it was the case of California, where you talked about there was sort of waning interest of media in a certain area after they've covered a story the first year. I'm just wondering sort of what collective impact you think you're getting in putting out the report on an annual basis. I guess I couldn't follow if the greens and the reds were yay or nay votes, or if they were yay or nay votes based on your position on an issue. and if it was just yay or nay votes on a particular bill, how you were able to measure the impact you're making on issues.
So the colors are whether the legislator is in agreement with our position.
Okay.
And our position is one that's more or less alignment, since we don't do a lot of specific bill advocacy. But it does give the legislator an idea of what the majority of our folks at least are thinking. That we rarely come to unanimity. It happens every once in a while, but the majority of our folks have this opinion, and you're with us or against us. And that is one of the impacts. The other one is the educational tool and getting the members to use it, and to have the public and their extended membership understand it. We could use better metrics. We have anecdotal feedback that awareness is growing and utility is growing, but we don't have any specific metrics. They would probably be good to get.
Peter, do you want to talk about the companion scorecard, just so people know the universe of things too?
Oh, I don't like the companion scorecard because I don't think we calculate scores very well. We do create a 4-page folder which gives a legislator a scorecard based on that alignment, but we had 55 legislators score 100%, which just doesn't make any sense in a year that we weren't very happy with, those of us who are advocates, very happy with the legislation that got passed. It's something I believe to be useful we need to work on. The idea that 4 legislators last year and 2 this year were champions was easier to deal with because they had worked on bills that the majority, or in one case unanimity of us, were in favor of. The scores, if we can figure out how to do them a little bit better, adds an extra dimension to telling the legislators how we feel. Look at the score you got. We'll get there. Again, having a score or even a significant row of green dots, will that have them pay attention to us or change their behavior? We're not sure. Those who are champions seem to have given us more access, that we are as useful to them as they are to us. Hopefully that doesn't sound too mercenary.
Can I ask one last question?
Sure.
It seems like all 3 reports are something that the media, if you were going to someone who covers a certain beat, that they would find these reports extremely helpful. And I'm wondering what work has happened with the media to have them use these resources to both lend credibility to your organizations, but also to give the public a better understanding about how egg issues to subsidies were being addressed at the legislature.
Claire and Pamela, do you all want to take that?
Sure. So we took a pretty narrow approach to our media outreach because of the political environment that we were just talking about. I think in another time and place we would have been more aggressive with that, and I think it's very timely, and we could have really attached it to a lot of things that are happening. Instead, we decided to pitch it quite narrowly to some friendly publications that we felt would really do justice to the nuance of what we were trying to say, and not just look for a really flashy headline that could kind of put a bullseye on a lot of the programs that we're trying to support, or that we think need more support. So we ended up getting a story put out by Civil Eats, and I think she did a really good, a fair job, and did a good job of kind of getting the nuance of this big giant report. And yeah, I mean, it would have been great to get do a lot more in the media with it, and it felt too tricky of a time. So we really focused on our dissemination, doing it in a more grassroots way through social media, through emails to sort of local and national partners, and having them share it with their network. And that, we always would love to elevate these issues in the media and get more coverage for them. But we also are sensitive to the fact that, sometimes the message can get lost when you're looking for a soundbite. And these are sort of complex policy landscapes that we wanted to be able to, I think, control the message a little bit.
And just to share a little bit more on the federal level, we had done another report that actually went more in depth on the federal level for these programs, and had been talking to the person that had been running Michelle Obama's Let's Move campaign, Deb Eschmeyer, basically right before the election. And she said, "Oh, this report will be great. It'll actually be the blueprint of what we're going to pass on." And then, of course, that didn't happen. So we ended up choosing not to even publish that because of what was going on at the time. And so I think we always have to be careful about the implications, positive and negative, of what we do.
On the other hand, with the Farm to School campaign, we've tried to get as much media coverage as possible for that and really elevate the issue. And it, of course, the more we can get our name out there, the better. But yeah, it's a tricky balancing act. And we decided grassroots outreach and doing things like this and being able to present to folks like you was just ultimately going to have a more positive impact for the kind of report that we did.
Thank you. Peter, I know you talked a little bit about the media outreach with some of your councils and pushing them. Did you want to add more about the legislative report?
Our goal is to get more eyes on it, perhaps to engage legislators. Again, the grassroots outreach on that probably does better. In dealing with reporters, what we found is they want an angle, they want novelty. So when we highlight a given legislator as a champion, papers in that district certainly have incentive. We have an analysis section, what we think are the trends of the year, and that perhaps could be a hook for reporters. It's something I think we would have to work on, is because we didn't highlight. We have to. Maybe what we need to do are have a number of press releases with different angles for different reporters. Again, that comes down to capacity. Paul has been thinking about usage of this, so I'm going to ask him to chime in with his thoughts on press outreach.
Yeah, sure. I would just say that I think we have, scorecards are kind of a dime a dozen, unfortunately. And so I don't know if folks heard that there was a good story on NPR last week or the week before about sort of the value of legislative scores value, in the context of NRA in particular. But I think we sort of distinguishing ourselves and our value is important. I think it's for sort of old, tired Capitol reporters that are an ever shrinking pool. I'm here in Sacramento, and I'm sure elsewhere in different state capitals. They're increasingly disinterested, or there's no one covering at least the food and ag beat in particular. So we don't really have food and ag beat reporters, I think, versus in, say even a state like Minnesota, the gentleman who spoke from there, I think you actually have more folks that might even cover ag than we do in California. And so I think there's a bit of a challenge with just there aren't enough beat reporters. Capitol reporters are tired of covering it. And I think that's why the district level stuff that Peter is talking about is important. And I think it's just this year we're a little more crunched than I'd like to be, but trying to do a bit more hand-holding with local food policy councils to help them draft their release, help them get it out, make sure they have reporter contacts. I think a lot aren't doing media and media advocacy already. And so just there's a bit of like a capacity gap there as well. So I think there are a lot of steps in that. Yeah.
Thank you. With the Maryland report, we did not do any media outreach with it. It was meant to be a tool that organizations in the state could use, but it was not, because there's no recommendations from it and there's not really any, there wasn't a point that we were trying to make with it in terms of what was happening with the food system. It really provided just baseline information. So we didn't take a route to do any promotion or media outreach with it because there wasn't necessarily a soundbite that we were promoting from it.
I mean, one thing I will say is that to the extent that you can share these with media, not as even a press release, but like as a, hey, just thought you might find this helpful, like you were suggesting, Michael, it can build those really, it's like a nice calling card, and it can be a good way so that next time, you know, if they do have a food or ag policy or issue that comes across their radar, that they'll turn to you for a quote or for a backgrounder. So, you know, I think that is one nice way to be able to use things like this. Not so much like you want to get, you know, it's so hard to break into the news cycle these days, but at least like you'll be then seen as an expert who can help them with their next stories and get a quote out of it.
I think that is a good final point. Thank you. And with that, I'm going to call time right now because it's 4. Just wanted to say thank you to Pam and Claire for joining us this afternoon and presenting and talking about your reports. We really appreciate it. Also to Peter and Paul, for you all for joining us as well and talking about your report out of California. I think it was a really great discussion. We don't have a date set for the next convening, but it will be, we're doing these quarterly, so we will send out a notice. If anyone has a topic that you want to discuss or a presentation that you would like to see for the next call with state councils, let us know. We're happy to coordinate and put it together for you. So for those of you in the north, please be safe in the snow. For the rest of you, enjoy the rest of your week, and thanks for